So thank you, Olivier, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming today. It's an honor to be here at Studensk and at the Center for War Studies in particular. I've been following the work you do here and your professors do here for several years now. Olivier and other professors here, Sten, of course, have both written widely about coalition wars, Afghanistan and Libya in particular. But coalition wars are not new, as anyone who's read Thucydides knows. That was a war between the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. In other words, a coalition war. Now, I won't go quite that far back today in my talk, but I do want to start by referencing another coalition war, which I think nicely encapsulates some of the central dilemmas of this kind of warfare. And that is the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, for those of you who need a quick refresher on 18th century balance of power Europe, the balance of power in Europe at the turn of the 18th century was multipolar. The leading powers of the day were Bourbon France, and you also had Great Britain and the Holy Roman Empire, which was, sorry, I'm just checking that my PowerPoint is working along with me here. And you also had, of course, the Holy Roman Empire led by the Habsburg Austrian royal family. Further east, you also had the Ottoman Empire. But basically what happens is in 1700, this guy, Charles II, the King of Spain, dies without an heir, plunging Europe into a succession crisis and eventually a continental war. Now, much like today, the royal houses of Europe back in 1700 were all related and intermarried. So what happens is the French Bourbon house has one claimant or candidate to the throne that they put forward, while the Habsburg Austrian royal family has their own preferred candidate. And in 1701, when the Bourbon candidate is selected to be King of Spain, Austria declares war on France. By the following year, most of Europe has taken sides in this war over who should be the King of Spain. And the continent goes to war over that question. You end up on one side with something historians call the Grand Alliance, made up of the Holy Roman Empire, or Austria at that point, Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and several minor German principalities or German states. And on the other side, you have the Bourbon Alliance, France and Bavaria. Now, eventually, an English general by the name of the Duke of Marlborough is made commander-in-chief of all coalition forces in Flanders. And he is quite a good military commander, but despite his talents as a military commander, it turns out it's quite difficult for him to manage this immense military effort of the Grand Alliance, particularly in Holland, where they're fighting. Although he is nominally the commander of all the forces of the Grand Alliance, he can't undertake any offensive movement without acquiring the permission of the Dutch field deputies assigned to him first. And on one occasion, in one of his letters, he's actually lamenting, he's complaining about 14 precious days being lost in the middle of battle in deliberation, in discussion between him and the Dutch field deputies about whether or not the English and Dutch forces should switch from the defensive to the offensive. And just as the Dutch leaders agree to Marlborough's plans to go on the offensive against the French, the general in the command of the Hanoverian contingent, so a German contingent, announces that his troops are not allowed to move unless they have the permission of the Hanoverian Minister of War. So it takes further time to sort out that relationship, because the Hanoverian prince had stipulated before assigning his troops to this war that their forces could not cross a particular river without him being consulted first. No sooner has the Elector of Hanover removed that restriction when a similar problem arises with a Prussian contingent requiring a separate appeal to the King of Prussia. You get the idea. Flash forward 300 years, and this map should look very familiar to you. This is a map of Afghanistan, right? Where American ISAF commanders like General Stan McChrystal and Dave Petraeus, both of them pictured here, would often complain about the challenges of leading a multinational force of several dozen countries, each of whom had their own restrictions or caveats and rules of engagement for what their armed forces were or were not allowed to do. And I think if we plop down Marlborough, we send him through time in a time machine and plop him down at ISAF headquarters in 2006, 2007 in Kabul in Afghanistan, I think he'd actually be oddly comfortable and sympathetic with the problems that McChrystal and Petraeus have. Many of these problems of how to wage war together with other countries would be familiar to him. So what's going on here? Why haven't we cracked the secret of coalition war in the years since Marlborough achieved his great victory at the Battle of Blenheim? Well, I argue it's because it turns out the command and control in these types of coalition or multinational wars is actually very hard. And there are parallel experiences, just like the example I gave you at the outset in the War of the Spanish Succession, and then I went to Afghanistan. There are parallel experiences, whether we're talking about the Duke of Wellington in the Napoleonic Wars, which, by the way, it was a series of wars in which it took 7 coalitions and more than a decade for European powers to appoint a commander-in-chief, or Ferdinand Foch, pictured in the middle, the supreme commander of the Entente in World War I, or the last gentleman pictured, who I'm sure many of you recognize, Dwight Eisenhower in World War II as SACEUR. So command and control is fundamentally about who in war has the authority to decide what forces do. And it's deeply political because surrendering authority to others is not something that most human beings like to do. And this is especially true when that authority in question has to do with your armed forces and hence your own national security and defense. So most of you are probably, as I said, familiar with Eisenhower's tenure as Supreme Commander of Allied Powers Europe in World War II. And he is Eisenhower, and that structure that was constructed to fight Nazi Germany in Europe in World War II is considered the most successful coalition command in history. But even so, the delegation of command and control authority was a delicate issue for the Americans and British for much of that war. And this is despite, as I said, having what is considered the most successful, most integrated headquarters in history. There were problems about how much authority to cede to generals from the other country. And these problems surfaced in every theater of the war, even in the European theater. Eisenhower ends up commanding the bureaucracy, what's called the Supreme Headquarters, Allied European Forces, or SHAEF, but not the actual forces in theater. And this is the case up and through the invasion of France, right? Normandy in the summer of 1944. We like to think of Eisenhower sort of leading the charge, but he's not. He at best only exercises what we call operational control, and I'll define that in a moment, of Anglo-American forces in Europe through the summer of '44. Actual command of the ground forces during the Normandy campaign actually belongs to a British commander of the 21st Army Group, Bernard Montgomery. And so although Eisenhower can direct Montgomery and give suggestions on questions of strategy and campaign plans, or desired objectives, he's prevented from exercising direct operational control over the battle until later in the war because of the rules that the Allies had agreed to at this point. So in theory, he's in charge of the multinational invasion force, but in practice, it's a British general, Montgomery, that's issuing the actual operational orders to American and British ground commanders during Normandy and up to about September of '44. Now let me take a step back here and define what I mean when I talk about command and control. In simplest terms, command and control, or C2, the military loves acronyms as you know, refers to the exercise of authority and direction of forces in battle. It's been called the eternal function of military organizations and, quote, the essence of warfare. Now, although the term command and control only formally enters the military lexicon after World War II, some notion of what we mean by command and control of military forces has always existed, right? In the military, however, command is often distinguished from control. Command is a personal function that is vested in a single commander, a single individual, that is. And by contrast, the notion of control can be exercised by multiple people, and in some cases, even by staffs at headquarters. So control is the regulation of forces and war-fighting functions to accomplish a mission in accordance with the commander's intent. It's fundamental to the successful execution of military operations. But the military authority that resides in control is always less than that resides in command. Indeed, well, let me just say one thing before I get to this slide. So in practical terms, there's been this belief in the military community in something they call the principle of unity of command. And this principle states that whenever possible, no member of an organization should report to more than one superior on any single function. And in practical terms, this manifests itself in a preference for something called unified command or unified command structures, where a single commander, often known as the commander-in-chief or supreme commander, exercises operational authority over the entire force. It turns out that when it comes to exercising an authority, these military and legal authorities in war, there's actually a hierarchy of them. So I spoke before about how control is always below that of command. Let me say a little bit more about that. The highest form of operational authority is operational command, or OPCOM for short. And operational command involves direction and exercise of authority by a commander over the entire operational process, from the planning and preparation of operations to their execution. OPCOM is defined as the authority of a commander to assign forces, specify tasks and missions, and delegate control to subordinate commanders underneath him or her. Now, a commander with OPCOM, operational command authority, is responsible for establishing campaign goals, identifying operational objectives, and overseeing the plans to achieve them. Beneath that, you have something called operational control, or OPCON, which involves the direction and orchestration of the fighting units in execution of campaign plan that has been thought up of by the commander. And so OPCON is more limited in terms of the authorities that it entails than OPCOM, and in general, it also tends to be transferred much more readily to other nations or commanders than is the case with OPCOM. There's also tactical command and tactical control, which has to do more with the tasks you assign to subordinates to carry out particular missions, but I won't go into that unless there are questions about it later, since our focus here is more on the operational command and control picture. Before turning to the types of command structures that we see in multinational wars, let me just say a few words now about national command structures, so the command structures that exist within countries. Each country has something which is called a national command authority, or chain of command through which lawful military orders flow. I'll speak briefly about the US case, since that's the case I'm most familiar with. And in America, the National Command Authority runs from POTUS, the President of the United States, also known as the Commander-in-Chief, through the Secretary of Defense. The combatant commander, the United States military is set up with regional commands, so the one that's probably the most familiar to everyone is CENTCOM, or Central Command, which has an area of operations that encompasses the Middle East, has been quite active in the last couple decades, right? It's headquartered in Tampa, Florida, at MacDill Air Force Base, and there is a four-star commander who's the commander of Central Command. And then underneath him, you would have the commander of U.S. forces, for example, in Afghanistan, who is directing efforts there. But this is actually a relatively recent organizational design for the United States. And you can see it's an example of a very simple, integrated, each person is only reporting to one person, though with some exceptions. I've done a lot of interviews in my research, and several American senior officers were annoyed that President Bush, the second President Bush, so President Bush the son, not the daddy, had a tendency to reach down, right, and bypass the combatant commander and ask for ask the advice and opinion of the commander in Iraq or Afghanistan. But that is actually something that's allowed, but officially this is how the reporting duty should go, right? So this is, as I mentioned a moment ago, actually a relatively recent structure. It comes in after World War II in 1947, because for much of history in the United States, the armed forces maintained separate command and control branches, structures for each of their services or armed branches. And that was actually a historical artifact of how that country, how the United States came into existence through revolution. So America's founding fathers were afraid to concentrate authority over the military in any single government branch or entity. So they end up, for those of you who've read the Constitution, dividing certain powers between the legislature, Congress, and the president. And they even extend this legacy of divided control into the armed forces or military of the new country. So they decide to have a separate chain of command for Army, land forces, and the Navy. And from 1798 until 1947, this is how the U.S. Army and Navy basically operated, under separate command and control structures. In practice, what this meant is that the senior-most Army and Navy commanders retained command and control, those authorities and powers I was speaking about a moment before, for their own service. Now, of course, ultimately, both of them are reporting back to the president, the commander-in-chief. But one direct consequence of having this divided national command structure is that the two services, the Army and Navy, often operate independently in wartime. And so it's not until the Mexican War of 1846 to 48 that the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy conduct their first joint operation. And during the Spanish-American War and the First World War, the Army and Navy, rather than formally integrate themselves, relied on a doctrine of mutual cooperation to carry out joint operations. Ultimately, it's the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 41 and America's entry into World War II that leads the U.S. military establishment and government to conclude that you need to integrate the command and control structures of these two services in order to fight future wars, in order to have a successful prosecution of wars in the future. But it's not until after the war, World War II in this case, with the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, that you get an integrated or unified command and control structure, which I showed you on the previous slide, which is established, of course, with the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947, otherwise known as the Pentagon. So that's an example of a national command element or structure. What about in multinational or coalition wars? Turns out there's a lot more variation of these structures in wartime, and I think it's helpful to think about this variation in terms of putting them on a continuum or a spectrum. So we have ideal types, and sometimes some cases will come closer to approximating a case than in other cases. But basically, this continuum or spectrum of command and control in multinational wars leads, I argue, from least integrated to most integrated. So at one end of the spectrum or configuration, we have, and this is featured at the top, independent command in which national forces remain under their own national commanders, report, of course, back to their own national command element or architecture. And an example of this would be the Crimean War, at least the first year of the Crimean War, 1853. Historically, this type of command structure in coalition wars, independent command, tends to be the most common, certainly at the outset of war. It's where we find most cases. Another category or type of command and control structure is what I call combined command. So you could also think of it as parallel command, in which there is shared authority over the direction of the war, sometimes through a committee, sometimes by having shared operational control over the same forces. There are different ways to have it. But one example, I think, is the Iraq War, the first Iraq War in 1990, in which the Saudis were very proud, as most countries are, of their military, and did not want to come under, for domestic audience reasons, did not want to come under the operational command or control of the Americans. So what we see instead is that the Saudis were given operational control of managing their Arab allies, and initially France as well, while the US would oversee all other coalition partners. But then in order to have these two chains talk to each other, US and Saudi military leaders created something they called the Coalition Coordination, Communication and Integration Center, or C3IC. I told you the military loves acronyms. Now, I should note that the C3IC did not technically command. It was more of a clearinghouse, but it integrated the coalition land forces into one solid effort. And they would receive reports, collect data, improve the information flow and synchronization of activities. So that's the second type of command structure you can see in coalition wars. At the far end of the spectrum, so the most integrated, you get unified command, where one nation, usually again in the guise of a supreme commander, is in charge. This is the classic example of Ferdinand Foch in World War I, or we could think of Eisenhower in World War II as well. It tends to be a little rare, though, historically. We have lots of recent examples of it, or more recent examples of it. But in my own research and looking at these different types of command structures, an early puzzle that arose was the fact that despite the military professionals in all countries pretty much agreeing that having unified command is a good thing, right? It was quite rare in coalitions. And so this was a puzzle to me. If everyone in the military in Europe, in North America, wherever agrees this is a good military axiom, a practice that we should follow, why is it so rare? And the more I looked at historical cases, the more it seemed like there was actually a pattern that was happening in war, a trajectory by which countries start out with independent or very loose, less integrated, we might say, types of command structures at the outset of war. And then as the war progresses, for some other reason, and I'm going to convince you in a moment what I think that reason is, but for now, let's just say because of some other reason, they adopt a more streamlined or integrated command and control structure as the war goes on. And I think that we can see in the cases where this happens that this process is not instantaneous, it's not smooth, it's often very slow and painful. And what I argue in my work is that there are these pressures or constraints, political constraints, also some technological constraints, but I focus on the political constraints for why countries at the outset of war are reluctant to integrate themselves. So my starting assumption in my research is that wars in general, and multinational wars in particular, are hard, right? I think I can get most of you to sign on to that assumption. And the reason is something I'm sure all of you are familiar with, these typical collective action problems that we have. There are, of course, a lot of barriers to capability aggregation. So a lot of the arguments you read is that countries form alliances. One argument, at least, is because you want to aggregate your capabilities. You want to have more tanks and guns and troops, right? But there are a lot of reasons why that might not happen. These are things that we could call barriers to capability aggregation. And they're not just technological barriers, as I said a moment ago. They're not just questions about whether do you use the same guns and do you have the same ammunition for those guns. But there are also cultural differences, right, in how militaries train and the doctrines they use. In World War I, for example, the British prefer to attack early in the day. The French prefer to attack later in the day. You can see how, if you're fighting together, that's a problem, right? Communication, and this isn't just a question of language. There's a very tragic incident in the Korean War in the Battle of Imjin River, and to this day the site is known among the British military as sacred ground, because during the Korean War an entire British regiment, the Gloucester's regiment, was virtually destroyed, annihilated. And an incident report afterwards, investigation into what went wrong, it turns out that the British commander had radioed for support to a nearby American unit, but there was a misinterpretation. Now, you're thinking they both speak English, right? But it was a cultural misinterpretation, because when the American commander asked how things were, right, whether the British commander replied, quote, "a bit sticky." Now, to American ears, that sounds like, okay, things are rough, tough, but you can survive, you can hang on, right? That's not what the British guy meant with things were being a bit sticky. And the American, not being familiar with that context and the British tendency for the British to keep a stiff upper lip, delayed sending reinforcements. And unfortunately, what ends up happening in April of '51 is that this entire British a regiment, is, as I said, virtually wiped out, 96% casualty rate, because of a cultural misunderstanding between countries that know each other quite well and fight a lot of wars together. So that's all to say there are lots of reasons why we might think coalitions have difficulties aggregating their capabilities together when they fight, to say nothing of strategic incompatibilities, right? Sometimes they have different political and military objectives. My argument's a little bit different, though. I argue that there are these constraints or pressures that lead countries not to adopt what should be the most ideal, the most beneficial type of command and control structure in multinational wars, that of unified command, because of these political constraints. Most organizations are traditionally inflexible, prone to stagnation, and fearful of change. This is especially true of militaries. And I argue for three reasons. One is because of our good old friend anarchy and self-help, right? States are going to be reluctant to voluntarily surrender control over their own security to others. For the military, they are the final and first line of defense against a country's integrity. So the military for a country is key to guaranteeing both its present and future security and safety. So governments are going to be unwilling, in general, to sign away operational command and maybe even operational control of their armed forces to foreigners, right? This is a condition that, of course, is always going to be present, but it's going to be strongest in war when you're vulnerable and you're worried, because you're fighting a war, that the allies may abandon your defense in favor of your own, right? We see this classic case of it in World War I, where early in the war, the British peel off towards the Channel because they're worried about protecting the Channel ports back to England, and the French peel off towards Paris because they're worried about protecting their capital, right? So that's this fear that's going to be constant, but you should still see some fluctuation in it. Another constraint, I argue, is the shadow of the future. the fear that today's ally may become tomorrow's enemy. And we can think of Churchill in World War II, who's very reluctant to share intelligence and new technology with the Soviets. Why? Because he's determined, some might say, but certainly convinced, that the next war will be against the Soviets, right? So the shadow of the future might also be another constraint that keeps you from engaging in more integrated command and control structures. And then, of course, you have this concept of prestige and desire for autonomy that is unique, some might say, to the military. The armed forces, the military occupy a unique position as defenders of the state. They're the man on horseback. They're highly emotionalized symbolic status in society. And they have a strong military ethos or ethic of not ceding authority to outsiders. So what I argue is that each of these constraints are going to be updated as new information comes in from the battlefield. And particularly, you're going to be learning from your performance on the battlefield. You're going to have both commanders in the field and politicians back home who are taking away lessons. And if things are going bad, then what do human beings try to do? We try to change things. You start experimenting. And often what you see is that this experimentation is always in one direction, towards more integration, right? So this pattern is what we actually see unfolding in civil wars. And I'll talk briefly about a couple of examples towards the end of my talk today. Now, you might be thinking, okay, what's the big deal at this point? Why is having unity of command or integrated command and control so important in war? What is it exactly that it does? It confers several benefits, right? Broadly speaking, we can group these into informational or situational awareness benefits. It lowers transaction costs. If you have an integrated command and control structure, set up, then you're not going to have to waste time discussing and thinking of costly and time-consuming ad hoc arrangements for what you're going to do for each particular battle with your allies who you're fighting on the same front with. So it also shortens the operational loop. You may have heard the Americans love to talk about the OODA loop. It's Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, OODA, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, right? That's a lot faster to do if you have an integrated command structure than if you have separate chains of command, each reporting to different, and then having to sort of come together by war committee or something. Another thing that integration can do is it improves monitoring. You get a better, I guess the Danish word for it would be overblik, right? You get a better sense of your battle space. And it helps you also coordinate your own forces. So it helps with agility, surprise, and speed, and synchronization of forces. And so I argue that integration confers these very important benefits in wartime, and it does so through these classic political science mechanisms of enhanced communication and coordination and reducing transaction costs. So let me take you to an example quickly, and that is World War I. Now, when most of you think about World War I, you tend to picture the trenches and stalemate of the Western Front. But the Eastern Front is a fascinating case for many reasons. Churchill called it the unknown war, and it still is, 100 years later, really an unknown part of World War I. And it's fascinating for several reasons, one of which is you have three great empires that emerge defeated, right? You have the Russian Empire, we know what happens with the Russian Revolution. We have Austria-Hungary that collapses, and we have the Ottoman Empire, which collapses as well. So really classic big power politics at stake. And it's also fascinating because of the scale of destruction. 11 million people in all are killed on the Eastern Front, but we tend to focus on what the British and French are doing, and later the Americans, who still argue, by the way, that they won World War I, on the Western Front. So let me talk a little bit about the Central Powers, about Helmut von Moltke and Conrad, the respective German and Austrian chiefs of the General Staff. Now, on paper, we should think that a model alliance should be that between the Germans and Austrians, right? If anyone should be good at fighting a war together, it should be these two guys. Why? Well, they've been in a formal alliance since 1879. They have a common enemy on their eastern border, Russia. They have a shared language and culture, and they have decades-long military contacts. They've been doing war games and staff rides and all that stuff the Prussians love to do for years. So again, they should be good at this. And based on my argument, we should expect to see, though, right, that they're reluctant to integrate and fight together and adopt unified command. And we should also expect to see this learning process where after things go bad and they suffer battlefield defeats, they start experimenting and tweaking their structures and eventually adopt a more integrated or unified command structure. And, surprise, surprise, it turns out that's exactly what we see. Now, I could go on for hours on, about the Eastern Front and World War I in general, but I won't. So let me just limit my comments to this. The opening months of the war do not go well for Berlin and Vienna, and it betrays, in a sense, the inadequacy of their preparations, because although they had carried out war games and lots of planning, they had explicitly said that when it came to the question of command and control, we'll save that for after the war starts, and especially for after we've each scored our first victory, right? So they're refusing to deal with this thorny issue. And so they start the war with an independent command and control structure. And the Germans initially score a defensive victory at Tannenberg, of course. Things do not go that well for the Austrians. They suffer horrendous losses. They lose about 400,000 men in one battle. To give you a sense, the Russians lost fewer than 300,000. So these are battles of enormous scale, but the Austrians just aren't off to a good start. So what does Germany do to support its ally? Well, it experiments, right? First, they think the problem is troops. The Austrians just don't know how to fight, right? They have no fighting spirit. They're not as good soldiers as us. So let's send them some German soldiers down to Galicia. Let's send some manpower. That must be the problem. And it turns out, incidentally, to give you an indication of how little they were thinking about command and control, that the first meeting between the German commander and the Austrian commander doesn't happen until mid-September. That's 7 weeks into the war. That's a little late for the two commanders who are fighting on the same front to get together and say, hey, what's the plan, right? So they're really ignoring this issue. And as I said, initially the German reaction is, let's just send them troops. That's the problem. Let's send them further south. To the front. The next thing they try to do after things continue to deteriorate is a combined offensive, right? Where instead of attacking Russia at two different points, let's attack together at the same time. Surely that'll work. Doesn't really work because they can't agree on where to attack or when to attack. So the Germans launched their attack on the 27th of September, and the Austrians say, we need 3 more days, so we're going to attack on October 1st. And needless to say, it doesn't go well. By the time the Austrians and Germans meet up to where they had agreed finally to attack the Russians have slipped away. So the first experimentation is with this idea of, well, if we fight together next to each other on the same portion of the front, surely that'll fix things. Doesn't work. Over the fall months, Germany decides that it needs to create its own headquarters on the Eastern Front, Oberöst in Posen, to take more attention on the Eastern Front, because up until that point, their command headquarters for the war was in the West, and they were focusing, obviously, just on France. But so then they're experimenting, saying, okay, we need to put more resources, men. We need to create a new headquarters here, right? But they're still not quite ready to recognize that there's a bigger problem here about command and control. And what happens after several more trials and defeats is that Germany decides to create an entire new army, Südarmy, under a German general Linsingen, to send it to help the Austrians. And they decide to share operational control for that army with the Austrians, thinking, okay, if we both have control of this new army, that's going to work. Doesn't work, right? Because it turns out the German commander, surprise, surprise, ignores the orders from the Austrians and only listens to his own headquarters. So again, things don't go well with this, and eventually what you happen to see is the establishment later in the war of a unified command headquarters. The Entente also struggles with this, so even though it's the Germans and the Austrians who achieve it first, there is some backsliding, and I'm happy to talk about why I think that's happening on the Eastern Front, but the Entente gets there with Ferdinand Foch in late 1917, early 1918, and of course establishes the famous Supreme Command that he leads. So let me just, in the interests of time, I'm happy to talk about other explanations that we might get from our political science literature about civil-military relations and why I think they're not as good as my answer. But at this point, I've probably talked so much about World War I that you're thinking, all right, so what? That was literally 100 years ago, right? But I argue that this is a familiar pattern that repeats itself in Korea and Afghanistan. And just let me say very quickly a few things about those cases. Now, when the Korean War breaks out in June of 1950, this is what the initial command structure looks like. Of course, we have the UN command, but it is, for all intents and purposes, an American command. In fact, it's created with the intention that it will be an American commander, at first Douglas MacArthur, who will be the UN commander. So this is what, you just need to focus on the fact that you've got the ROK, Republic of Korea Army, they have a general headquarters, and then they have their corps under them. This is what things look like at the outset of war. And interestingly enough, this is despite the fact that the president of South Korea at the time, Syngman Rhee, signs a letter on July 15th giving operational control of the South Korean armed forces to Douglas Commander, the UN/American commander. But despite this letter, we'll see that despite those intents, the reality is very different. In September of 1950, you've seen some change already happen. But still, the South Korean army has pretty good control of their own divisions, right? At this point, there's only one South Korean division under direct command and control of the UN and Commander MacArthur, and that's a division that's in reserve, right? So the point is that the South Korean, despite the president signing over this letter that says, I'm going to transfer control of my armed forces to you guys, in practice, that's not what happens. The South Koreans are allowed to retain a lot of independence, and so they're allowed to do their own thing, basically. And this works pretty well, everyone thinks, until China invades and manages to push South Korean and UN forces all the way back down the peninsula. And what you happen to see there is in a first command change, you see the Americans say, okay, these divisions didn't perform well, so let's put them under a direct American commander. Surely that'll help things, right? But we'll leave the rest alone. After another Chinese offensive, the fifth offensive actually in April through May of 1951, it's a disaster for the UN and South Korean forces, and they take away all of the corps headquarters, all of divisions, and put them under. So what you're left with pretty much is a headquarters in name only. What about Afghanistan? Well, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, when we talk about Afghanistan, we need to recognize the Operation Enduring Freedom, Coalition of the Willing part, run from CENTCOM, and ISAF, which starts out as being a Kabul multinational force, an initially 6-month rotation. The first rotation was a British general, John McCall. Anaconda, the first major campaign in the war, right? You have a Canadian regiment. They're the only national regiment other than the Americans who are fighting. You have SOF, or Special Operations Forces, from several countries, but including Australia. You can see that these dotted lines, they refer to the different authorities that each country is granting the American commander. And of course, down below, you have these different task forces made up of what we were at that time calling the Afghan Northern Alliance. ISAF is still doing its own thing in Kabul. As you all know, being where you are, NATO gets involved in 2003, and the command structure starts to mutate again and morph, right? It's a little bit complicated because you have the national countries reporting back through the NATO command and control chain, and as well to their national command element, right? To London, to Paris, and so on. And the Americans are also trying at this point to think about, okay, what do we do, right? How do we fix or merge the missions and the structures for fighting? Long story short, this is how you end the war, right? Through a series of steps, you get an American COM-ISAF or commander who becomes dual-hatted, much like Secure, reporting up through two chains. So there is this process of evolution and learning going on, and it's in a similar trajectory, I argue. What about today? Well, it turns out OPCON questions and issues is still a pretty big deal. I don't know how many of you follow what's happening in Korea, not just the nuclear stuff, but the changes in the US South Korean alliance. For many years now, the South Koreans, particularly the Liberal Party there, has been lobbying for a change in the command and control structure that the Americans have with the South Koreans. The existing structure is pretty much a vestige left over from the Korean War, where you can see on the right side, the chain of command goes from the United States, US President, Defense Ministry, Pentagon, right? Joint Chiefs of Staff. You have a senior committee level meeting, and you also have military committee meetings that senior Americans and Korean politicians and generals participate in. And then you have, at the operational level, you have the ROK US Combined Forces Command, CFC, and you have American and South Korean forces underneath it. Now, by precedent, by history, we might say, the commander of CFC, Combined Forces Command, has always been an American, right? And up until 1994, that American commander, had both peacetime operational control over South Korean armed forces, as well as, in the case of war, he would get wartime operational control. In 1994, that changed because of domestic South Korean pressure, and the South Korean military got back peacetime OPCON. They're still, the Liberal Party in particular, is still fighting and advocating for, at least publicly, a transfer of wartime OPCON, right? So these are still very much, they may seem technical and obtruse, but they're still very much issues that militaries and countries care about and are reflected in current developments. This is my last slide. Main takeaways. I just want to leave you with 3 points. Organizations, in particular organization matters, how you put together units. Command and control is very important in military operations, and I would argue has often been overlooked. And lastly, the argument of much of my research is that military failure, when things go bad, it leads to experimentation and adaptation in war. So with that, let me end my formal remarks, and I very much look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.